Of the joint meeting of the Facilities and Real Estate and Budget Finance and Business Operations Committee. No, the rumor is not true. We're not showing Avatar this morning on the screen in the back, although we certainly could show Avatar on the screen in the back. What a great facilities, and thanks, Florida State, for hosting us this morning. I want to welcome, we've got a bunch of our new Board of Governors members here with us this morning watching. I know committee assignments haven't been done yet, but thanks for coming this morning and noticing what the budget and finance and real estate committees do. It's an interesting process, and hopefully it'll be fun. That has yet to be seen. Before I begin as well, one of the items that we normally take up at our joint facilities and budget committee is our legislative budget request, our LBR, for the year. Typically we do it at this meeting. However, since our 11-12 LBR isn't going to be discussed until September, and we're not having an August meeting, we don't really need to develop the guidelines this early for the LBR for next year. We're going to wait and see what happens this legislative session. We've got time. Our plan is to draft the 11-12 LBR and have it presented and discussed at our May conference call, and then the Facilities and Budget Committee will approve those guidelines at the June meeting. So there's still time to work through that process. We're obviously in the middle of our legislative session. The situations change every day, and we'll focus on that for now. In fact, since I brought it up, Tim, why don't you give us an update on what's happening with the state legislative session, our budget, the board budget. Let us know what's going on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm going to get a PowerPoint slide up here for you in just a second. The first thing I want to talk about is the General Revenue Estimating Conference, which met last Tuesday. For the first time in a while, there was really no bad news coming out of that conference. There's estimates are on track for this year, a little bit of an increase for next year, and here you can see a graph of what the projections are over the next 4 years. So a little rosier picture for the state of Florida, but you need to remember that 3 years ago, our general revenue collections exceeded about $30 billion. And in 2012-13, we're only expected to be at about 26, so still well below our high water mark of 3 years ago. And also, obviously, these revenues for 10-11 at about $23.5 million isn't sufficient to cover all of the state's obligations. You've heard a lot of discussion about there being a deficit for the state budget of $1 to $3 billion. So they're having to work within these general revenue estimates, and that's what they'll be basing their 2010-11 LBR on. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the budgets that have come out of the House and Senate the last couple of days. And in your packet, there's a yellow sheet, and I want to go over this just a little bit. And it's different from what is on page 2 of your packet, and it has been revised since I sent you an email last Wednesday evening. And I want to go over just a few of the items on here. And this document is laid out with the Board of Governors amended request from January, the governor's recommendation, and then a column for the Senate and House recommendations. And these are coming out of the appropriations committees at the moment. They're still having deliberations, so these numbers, as the chair said, will be changing as we go forward. But if you look on the first page, particularly row 31, which is a tuition increase of 8%. Both the House and Senate committees are recommending an across-the-board 8% increase, which would generate about $73 million. And you need to remember that this includes undergraduate increase, which all the universities will have to do, but it also assumes that the universities will increase out-of-state tuition by 8%, graduate and professional tuition by 8%. And historically, universities have not done that because we are one of the highest, if not the highest, in the country on out-of-state tuition already. So there's some numbers built in here that, may not come true depending on what boards of trustees do for tuition increases for those other areas. Just an 8% undergraduate increase is about $32 million. So there's roughly $40 million built in here that may not transpire. If you look at row 41, called base budget reduction. And if you go across, you'll see the Senate is recommending a $110 million cut to the base, which is about a 6%. And then the House is recommending $58 million cut to the base. That House number is down from a week ago when it was about $92 million. So their committee was able to receive a little larger allocation and thus helped us out on those budget reductions. Okay, if you'll drop down to row 44, it says reprogram for state priority areas, and you'll see a number there for the Senate column of a little over $50 million. This is money they're putting back into our budget. After they're cutting $110 million, they're giving us $50 million of it back for state high priority areas, and there's some proviso language we'll go over in a minute, but basically this is focusing on STEM related fields. So if you net the base budget cut and this add back, you end up with a net reduction of about $60 million, which is close to what the House has of about $58 million. I also want to point out, jumping back to row 42, it says base budget reduction, student financial assistance. The universities receive a direct appropriation or student financial aid of about $17 million. 75% of those funds must go towards need-based aid. And that appropriation, direct appropriation, is down from about $21 million 3 years ago. So they're continuing to cut our need-based financial aid component. But yet remember, as part of our tuition differential fee, part of those revenues have to go towards need-based aid. So we're losing a little bit of money on the state side, and universities will have to decide if they'll make that up on the tuition differential side or from other sources. And the last item I want to point out is on row 21. It's the new Florida initiative. You can see, the board and the governor had rolled this out in January. There's nothing in the House or Senate budgets on those as of yet. Also in your packet, there is a one-pager on the new Florida initiative that you can use as you're talking with folks over the next few weeks about New Florida. And this document outlines what we can expect from the New Florida initiative, what type of outcomes we'll be generating if we would receive these funds, and what type of investment it would take from the state to do this. So I think that's behind the blue sheet in your folder. And I don't know if Chancellor, if you wanted to mention anything about New Florida conversations at this point, or talk about that later in the board meeting.
I think we'll talk about it later.
Okay.
Thanks, Tim.
Okay, if you'll take your yellow sheet and flip over to the second page, which is a narrative document. It says Senate Higher Education Appropriations Committee proposed proviso in conforming bill language. Now, this is some language. I just want to point out a couple of things of interest to the committee. The first one is titled energy consumption. There's some language that would ask universities to reduce their campus-wide energy consumption by 10% using 2007-8 as a baseline. And we know the universities have been working on this for a number of years, but it would require them to do a report to the legislature and the governor by January of 2011. And the next item on that page is called state priority funds. This is the proviso tied to the $50 million that the Senate is allocating or providing back to us for high priority needs. And you can see the language that they're using and where this would focus on STEM related fields, health, education, and other high priority state and regional workforce needs. And universities would be required to submit a plan to the chancellor on how they're going to address those needs, and the chancellor would have to present that to the legislature by December. And you can go through and look at some other items on here related to library automation. And then if you flip the page, there's some language regarding some block tuition at the University of Florida. There's some additional language being provided on debt service, further explaining auxiliary enterprise definition, kind of clarifies some vague language that we have there that we had a big discussion in January at our facilities committee meeting on this. And then the very last page is some bright future changes that the Senate is proposing, fairly significant changes. Their budget currently has about $360 million for Bright Futures, which is down from about $430 million from this year, and that's a result of all these changes they're proposing. And there's one little typo on this page. I want to point that out. It's the third bullet, which talks about reducing the number of credit hours covered by Bright Futures from 110%. It should be program requirements to 100% instead of that 1,000/0, so change that to 100%. So any questions about the university system proposed budgets before I move on to the board general office?
Questions for Tim on the university budgets, which are changing every day.
Mr.
Governor, Chancellor?
I'll defer.
Oh.
To blind benefits.
You talk about row 43, employee compensation and benefits. Yeah, the House has $65 million. We have not heard anything from the Senate. We know there's been a lot of discussion about employee salary cuts, changes to health insurance, where employees may have to pick up more of that cost, and possible changes to retirement, but there's nothing definitive on the Senate side yet.
Chancellor?
Thank you, Chairman. Tim, can you tell me about block tuition? When I was a poor old university president, I thought we had block tuition capability of some sort or another.
Yeah, I think we looked at this, and if Vicky's here, she may need to provide a legal opinion, but I think it's under our opinion that you can do block tuition absent a statutory direction. We think we have enough authority to do that.
Okay, without a statute?
Yes.
Okay, I'm just curious.
Other questions for Tim on the university budget proposals? Yeah, Governor.
Tim, are there projections on how much revenue, or how much rather the savings will be on these Bright Future changes? Are there any ideas?
Well, the current year Bright Futures budget was about $430 million. The Senate has the budgeted next year for $360, so a savings of approximately $70 million based on all these changes.
Other questions? Seeing none, Tim, will you talk about the board budget?
Okay, in your folder again, there's a blue sheet. It talks about the Board of Governors General Office. If you flip over to the second page of that just for a moment, this just kind of gives you an idea of the history of our positions and budget over the last 5 years. And you can see in 07-08 was kind of the high water mark for the board, about $8.2 million and 65 positions. And we're down to about $5.6 million and 53 positions. We're primarily funded by general revenue, and you can see we're at about $3 million this year. And, we lost $2 million last year, but $1.5 million was provided back to us as part of federal stimulus funding. So out of our 49 filled positions, 20 are being supported by federal stimulus. And the Chancellor had asked the other day about some other systems. So there below the box is just an idea of a few other systems based on some SHIO data of the size of other governing or coordinating boards, number of positions, and their operating budgets. If you flip over back to the first page, this is where we need the board's help in working with the legislative leadership on our board office budget. And this kind of outlines some of our positions, where they're funded from, some of our fixed cost. And then there at the table, you can see our 9-10 budget compared to what the House is recommending and compared to what the Senate is recommending. Both sides have proposed eliminating 3 of our existing vacant positions, which we can't fill anyway. You'll recall we had a budget issue in our LBR in January to try to get more money to fill those 3 positions. They're proposing taking those, and both sides are roughly taking about $200,000 of our budget, which in the grand scheme of things isn't a whole lot, but an operation of our size, which is pretty small, 200,000 is pretty significant. Any questions on the board general office?
Chancellor?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to stress, if it needed to be stressed, that probably our greatest problem is the fact that we have 20-some-odd positions funded with federal stimulus money. So even though we've got a serious problem right now trying to keep up with the things that we want to do and have to do based on the reductions, at some point we're going to have to pay the piper, and if that money isn't restored, we have 20 positions more at risk. I know everybody looks at that federal stimulus and says we'll worry about that next year. I'm worried about it now because, again, we're hanging 20 positions on that to the lowest funded and smallest of the large state university system offices. As I said when I came here, I'm not an empire builder. That's never been my forte, but I know with the responsibility that we have in these days and times to oversee the third or fourth largest system in America, you at least have to have enough people to be able to do the job adequately, and also to protect the integrity and the oversight responsibility of the Board of Governors with confidence. So I've never been a whiner for positions or money, but we have an immediate problem, and if that isn't enough, we have a next year problem that is staggering if, in fact, something doesn't occur on the stimulus side. And, of course, I'm not speaking for just us. The stimulus issue is everybody's issue because next year we'll be here before you know it, and it will be time to pay the piper. And while the stimulus money has allowed us to carry on some of our functions, some of our personnel activities, that temporary signpost that we've all looked to regarding the stimulus money is about to come up and bite us. So we're going to have to start to consider that issue now because next year we'll be here very quickly. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chancellor. And Tim has just flipped to the right page along the lines of the Chancellor's comments. 152 million of the House budget for higher ed is federal stimulus year 2 money. And if that goes away next year, and if we continue the trends, I mean, even if you looked at the trends of our revenue estimating, it looked like it was trending positive, but it doesn't take into account the growth of the other programs, which are mandatory growth and requirements and challenges to the budget. We may be looking at a tougher budget situation next year as a state than we are this year if this economy doesn't turn around, and there's no sign of that happening. So imagine the double whammy of worse revenue pictures and losing $152 million of federal stimulus. We've got a tough road to hoe in the next 12 months, and the Chancellor is correct in trying to think forward about that right now. I know a lot of the universities have started taking steps last year when the writing was on the wall, and you're commended for that. I'll just ask you to continue doing that because I think it's going to get real ugly real fast. Tim, anything else?
And I'll just follow up on that. In the Senate budget, you notice they have $143 million, and so they've actually added $18 million in general revenue, recurring general revenue, to start to replace some of that, but there's a long ways to go to get it all replaced. And I will point out back on the board budget, on the House recommendations, last week we were about a $600,000 cut, so they were able to come up with a more of an allocation to help us somewhat. But, so progress is being made, and that's all I have regarding the budget.
Any other questions for Tim on the university budgets or the board budget?
Okay. A little slice of heaven, Tim.
Oh, boy.
That's my line. It's just a ray of sunshine, this guy. Okay, agenda item number 3 is approval of the 2010-2011 operating budgets for auxiliary facility bond covenants. It's on page 4 of the packet you were mailed. We generally have, due to certain bond covenants and certain of our financing operations, a review of operating budgets for auxiliary units at some of the universities. The board needs to, under those bond covenants, adopt the operating budgets for upcoming fiscal year, July 1, 2010 through June 30, 2011. Tim, just give us a couple minutes, walk us through the package starting on page 4.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair. Yes, starting on page 4 is the agenda item, and actually starting on page 6 are the income and expenditure statements from the various universities who have bond covenants for various auxiliary facilities. I do want to point out that there is a corrected page for the University of Central Florida. It's in your folder. It would replace page 20 of the packet. We found a little error on the debt service for 2010-11, but universities have provided these to us. We've reviewed them to make sure they have sufficient revenue to cover their debt service obligations and other operating expense of the auxiliary unit, and would recommend the committee of moving these forward to the full board for approval.
Great, thank you, Tim. We've been briefed on these. Anyone have any questions with regard to these budgets? Seeing none, is there a motion to approve the resolution? Got a motion from Governor Temple. Is there a second? A second sounded like Governor Tripp. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. And opposed. Motion carries. We will send it to the full board. Item 4 of the agenda is to review the Budget Committee work plan. For those of you new to the process, every year we adopt a work plan for each of our committees, trying to set forth what it is we're going to accomplish that year and remaining flexible for any surprises that may occur. If you'll turn to page 24 in your packets, you will see the beginning of our work plan. It's kind of on a landscape print there. This kind of covers the major areas where we'll be focused in the next 12 months, but also, as I said, leaves open some flexibility for changes in the future. Our two biggest items as the Budget Committee, obviously, are the annual legislative budget request we'll adopt in September and the tuition differential fee analysis and reporting and approval that we will do a little bit later at our June meeting. On page 25, and I want to draw your attention to that, is our tuition differential fee timeline. We talked a little bit about it at our January meeting. Starting on 26, we've got some draft forms that we are asking the universities to complete this year to provide us with information about tuition differential and their request for fall. If you remember last year, it was our first year in reviewing the process. It was somewhat of an accelerated process. We weren't quite sure all the information that we needed, all of the metrics that we needed. The university boards of trustees adopted, and we moved forward. This year we'd like to, in conjunction with the universities, work a little closer in considering each of the universities' requests so that will be a much more extensive process for us this year as a budget committee. And again, that will start in June, and those request forms are there starting on page 26. In addition to the standard data that we're requesting on 26 and 27, we're also requesting, if you'll take a look at pages 28 and 29, more information. Here what we're asking the universities to do is give us information on the initiatives they adopted last year, their success, how they worked out, and how they're going to implement them for fall 2010 as well, and particularly how they spent their funds in the budget cycle. We have a report that we're required to give to the legislature, and this is where we gather this information for and on behalf of the universities. We've been briefed on this. We've talked about these a bit. Does anyone have any changes, suggestions, questions, issues with regard to the tuition differential, request information, and or reporting forms? Chancellor?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. This is just for general consumption, but it is regarding last year's reporting going forward, and it is, I suppose, just because I came from there. Just a reminder that the new requirement is laid out in statute regarding reporting from the Board of Governors to the Florida Legislature, but also a general reminder to all of us that the requirement to report the dollars created by the differential tuition last year had a couple of caveats laid on them. Number one, there was the grandfather clause that brought down the total potential of the percentage increase in tuition. Anyone who had matriculated into the university, I think prior to 2007, was excluded from the differential tuition. There also was the 30%, and continues to be, of course, the 30% requirement for needs-based financial aid. I only say that to remind people that the amount of money generated at the institution level by the increase, especially in the first couple of years, will not be near as substantial as increases would be going forward. I suppose, Dr. Pritchard, give you FAU as an example, and we're probably not different on a pro rata basis from anyone else. With the implementation of the 15% increase during this fiscal year, once you netted out the 30% needs-based financial tuition, which is a good thing, and once you grandfathered out students before 2007, you generated a net of, if memory serves, about $600,000 to the university. And while that is a wonderful amount of money to have, I just want to put some context on this thing, that it is probably not the amount of money that many people think it is. So it probably will be relatively easy for Florida Atlantic University to explain what they did with that money. And I'm not saying that to be glib, I'm just suggesting that in this first couple or 3 years of reporting, if you're looking for a cure for the common cold from that money, I would submit that FAU is probably using it for the obvious, and will report that as most or all of our universities will. I'm not trying to diminish the importance of differential tuition at all. I am simply trying to remind people that in the first couple of years, those requirements and that grandfather clause was laid on that potential, and therefore, as we look at the reports coming from the universities, I would suspect in large measure they will probably be fairly obvious to everyone in terms of what they were able to do with the money. It'll become obviously more sophisticated over time as differential tuition plays out to the market, as amounts of money are generated, but I just wanted to lay that out there for contextual purposes this morning, Mr. Chair. Thanks.
Thank you, Chancellor. Other questions or comments on the differential tuition forms that we've set forth, or the process moving forward? Okay, seeing none, then we'll move on. If you take a look at page 31 of your packet, at the beginning of the meeting I talked a little bit about the LBR guidelines and how we adopt them and when we'll be adopting them. On page 31, we've got a LBR operating calendar sort of setting forth the process which we will follow in adopting the LBR this year. The only change is adoption of the guidelines, which we're going to do a little bit later. Staff is going to update the calendar and get it back to the board after this meeting is over. Questions on the calendar? All right, seeing none, we're going to move on to agenda item 5, which is approval notice and intent to adopt regulation 3.001, campus energy management. This is a new regulation for the state university system which addresses emergency management. It's certainly a greater awareness to us today, particularly in light of the challenges that we've seen at Virginia Tech, H1N1 pandemic, and frankly, even Haiti relief operations. I mean, all of these things highlight challenges that we are facing in our own university system. And as a system, we're receiving an increased share of federal dollars to devote to emergency preparedness. And although we've talked about emergency management in the past, we've had some presentations from Working Task Force and that sort of things, it's now time to try to establish a formal emergency management protocol for the state university system. So let me ask Chris Kinsley, who is our designated emergency coordination officer for the state university system. That's a lot of hats you wear, Chris. Will tell us more about the proposed emergency management regulation. Chris.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And really what this regulation does is formalize the good things that are already happening and that we have in place in the state university system and the protocols that we follow at the board office and our coordination with the state emergency management office. And just to walk through this very briefly, on page 33, this is in your packet, this has been developed in coordination with emergency management officers at each university, and we've shared it with the CFOs, the general counsel, the provost, because this is a regulation, of course, that cross-cuts all sectors of the university life. The first part is section where it talks to the comprehensive emergency plan and continuity of operation plans. The universities already have these in place, but this just formalizes that process. That it's required by law, but it puts it in our regulation. The second section of it indicates, our protocol. I need to make sure, as the emergency coordination officer, that our board contact information is up to date with the state office, and the universities have our contact office. It sounds very mundane. If there was an emergency and a university couldn't reach the chancellor or couldn't reach the chief of staff, that would then be, very problematic. Likewise with the universities, staff change, phone numbers change, locations change. So this just formally codifies that. And I will say, especially in light of what Tim Jones talked about earlier with budget cuts, my experience when I inherited this position was there'd been changes. Sometimes the quality of the work that's done without a formal procedure in place is very individual dependent. This makes certain that even if I were to leave or not be the emergency coordination officer, that the protocol would continue, that things would be up to date. So that's really one of the key importances of this regulation. I want to make sure the board is aware that the board general office itself does not have a continuity of operations plan individually, but we would fall within the broader context of the Florida Department of Education, again, relative to our size. To maintain an emergency 24/7 operation with 40-something people is just impossible. So we fall within a much bigger agency and work very closely with Department of Education. And that's basically the details of the regulation. This is the first notice. We'll continue to take public comment, university comment. I would hope to bring back a final regulation before we go into the hurricane season.
Chancellor.
Thank you. I just wanted to take this opportunity with this particular regulation to point out that going forward, you're going to see a number of regulations promulgated for the board on their behalf. The Board of Governors obviously has constitutional oversight responsibilities, and here is a perfect example where we know that each of those 11 universities has really very fine emergency management policies, practices, and procedures at the institution level, and yet we feel it's necessary to make sure that you as BOG members are secure in the knowledge that you have a policy so that there is a dovetailing of effort so that you can satisfy your roles and responsibilities for that constitutional oversight without overburdening the universities on things that they're already doing. Chairman Tripp, when we get to your activities and audit, another good example, universities now all have audit charters at their institutions. They have policies, practices, and procedures to work through the myriad audits that they deal with, from federal to local to state, and yet it's I think important that the Board of Governors have that policy in place to make sure, again, that you are satisfying confidently your roles and responsibilities without ever giving anyone the idea that the Board of Governors can go out and audit the audits. This is a move not only to better articulate with what the universities are doing, in this case on emergency management, but also to help us help you better satisfy your roles and responsibilities constitutionally to assure that that is happening without micromanaging the good work that's already being done at the universities.
Other questions or comments? Chris, do you get a badge or something?
I do get official badge from the State Emergency Management Center. Maybe I'll bring that back later today. It's very impressive looking.
I think we'd like you to wear that.
And Mr. Chairman, Chris will be, in the case of any major natural disasters, on site at the institutions. I've already determined that if someone were to see a significant hurricane, we would send Chris immediately to that site.
That's good. We'll dispatch him in the official jumpsuit, and off you go.
I am a CPA. I can help you file the claim.
Fluorescent, like,
there you have it.
I had those when I was a patrol. It was cool. Any other questions or comments for Chris with regard to this regulation? If not, is there a motion to adopt the notice of the approved regulation? Got a motion and a second. Sounded like Governor Tripp with the motion and Governor Edwards with the second. Any discussion? Seeing none. All in favor, please say aye. And opposed. The motion carries. Tim, lose the fireman hat, put on the construction hat, and if you'll talk us now through agenda item number 6, the amended 2010-2011 fixed capital outlay LBR request. We're going to cover the latest PICO request. It's changed a little bit, and there are a few technical items to talk about and review as well this morning. Chris, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. In your packet, there's a white packet. I'm not as creative as Tim with the blue and the yellow. It's entitled the 2010 State University Fixed Cap Out Legislative Budget Request. And let's first go to the PICO list. The estimating conference met. They're shuffling.
It's not in the packet, it's in the maroon notebook on our desk.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Came out late.
Sorry? Garnet. I forgot where I was. I'm sorry. Silly me.
Very good.
If it's not black or gold.
Oh, if I may continue then. What we're presented with by the PICO Estimating Conference was a $50 million increase to $153 million in the current year, the 10-11 year, a decrease in years 2 and 3. So what we're basically presented with is a reprioritization of existing projects, and so all these projects should be ones that were presented previously in January. And just to go over the general thought process was, if we focus on the middle year, it's shaded, the 2011-2012 year. That is a record low year. Overall, as a system, we have $48 million. That is not sufficient even to meet the basic critical deferred maintenance needs of the system. So the process we took there was very similar to one we've used in the past. Every university received a proportionate share based on the historic 10-year PICO allocation. So no university receives as much as they requested or might need for maintenance, but they all get the same amount. And we hope that 11-12 actually turns out to be a better year. That will, of course, we'll have several more conferences before we get to next year. Likewise, for 2012-13, that's again a very thin year, and we do a proportionate allocation again on infrastructure. We then, let me continue to talk about year 3, the 2012-13 year. What we do there is we do start, as we saw in the operating budget, we also see in that year the PICO budget starts to recover, not to the levels we've seen in the past, but does recover, and we start to new construction projects. But every project is not funded at the level the university would request. But those are starts, and again, that's very much proposed. For the current year, the very much a common sense type approach. We funded infrastructure as much as we possibly could, and we took projects that were already on the drawing boards, or in some cases actually coming out of the ground, and tried to finish those projects up and complete what we started, which is, of course, the BOG guideline and the BOG priorities. So as much as possible, with a very kind of abnormal PICO funding pattern, we applied the board guidelines to the list. I'd be happy to go over any particular questions.
Thanks, Chris. Any questions for Chris with regard to the PICO list in front of us? Governors, presidents?
Chair, I just want to thank the universities. They worked very carefully with us. They recommended some changes within their allocations, which were fine. They were knowledgeable of the available amount of money, how it was being appropriated, and again, with good input from the universities, we were able to make a little bit of money go considerably further with their help, so we thank them for that.
Thanks, Chancellor. Any other questions for Chris with regards to the PICO funds? Madam Chair?
Hey, Chris, how are you?
Hi, Madam Chair.
I miss you. I have a question, I guess, about the USF allocation for the Polytech new campus phase 1. I guess that's on page, can't tell what page it's on.
I have it in front of me.
2.
Page 2 of the handout.
And I want to make sure that's the $10 million allocation for 2010-2011. Is that correct?
Yes, that $10 million for the Polytechnic campuses is correct.
And then next year is when we complete, I guess the 1.4 million is the final completion.
Yeah,
phase 1.
that will complete the basic phase 1 building for the campus. The campus does have some additional infrastructure needs, but they're things that I think all our institutions have recognized for years, things like they have parking lots that are unpaved. Well, we have parking lots that are paved probably at all our institutions. Because even in good times with PICO, we're pretty much on a pay-as-you-go basis. That might be unfamiliar to some of with private development where you build out the entire site and then drop in buildings. We build a building and build just enough sidewalk and road for that building typically, and then we do the next one, then we do the next one, and that's what really we're looking at for the Polytech campus, that it's kind of a pay-as-you-go approach.
And then the 10 million that we have allocated in 2010, 2011, that's in addition to the 10 million that's allocated in the Senate budget on the yellow document that we got with Tim. Is that
Yes,
correct?
that 10 million right now appears to be in the operating side of the house, so it's in addition to.
Yes, this is actually the money that was approved by the Board of Governors for the planning of that facility for the last year or two. That you see on that sheet.
Other questions for Chris Kensley?
May I move to the technical item, sir?
Sure, thank you, Chris.
Okay. The next item is attachment 2. It's the same listing of PICO projects, but in BOG priority order. This is actually the list that's required by law. I will not go through that because it is the same projects, but just in order of BOG priority. And that's how it generally will appear in the Appropriations Act. Attachment 3 is some good news. This is the PICO remodeling, renovation, repair funds, the formula funds. We don't actually have to propose it. It's by statutory formula. It's up to $54 million. That is, by historic terms, a very good allocation. So for our basic routine, day-to-day patch and repair type maintenance, we do have a very good allocation proposed for 10-11. So I think that's one bright spot in our capital budget. Attachment 4 is the Cortellis list. This was approved by the board in January. We had a couple of technical clarification items. The list is still at, it was 83.5, it's 84.1. I'm not optimistic on Cortellis funding, but I wanted to present it to the board just in an abundance of caution to make sure the technical clarifications were formally presented. If I may, I'll move to attachment 5 and 6.
Let me just stop
Yes,
you
sir.
first. Do we have any questions on the first 4 attachments? Just for the record, it still stuns me that Cortellis doesn't get funded on a regular basis. Those are $2 dollars for the legislature, and it's money that's sitting there waiting to be used. It's jobs ready to be put into the ground. And for the record, it just stuns me that we don't get those funds funded. Governor Parker.
Mr. Chairman, we had talked at several meetings, I guess, about this issue, and we talked about different things that we thought we should do in order to shed light on the lack of Cortellis funding. Have we made any progress or done anything with that? I don't know.
You know, we had the entire work session on it about 6 months ago. You know, you're looking at an $84 million expenditure, which would generate almost $170 million worth of construction right away. Anything we can do to shed light on this, if we talk to our legislative friends and partners, I know they've got a very tough year ahead of them. But if you're looking at trying to stimulate this economy, stimulate growth, stimulate jobs, funding Cortellis is an easy way to get $2 dollars. To me, we need to be spreading that word as much as humanly possible. And we have donors, frankly, whose money is tied up waiting to be used, and it's got to be very frustrating for those donors who have made a commitment, made an investment, made a sacrifice to see it just not being used the way they'd hoped it would be used or matched the way the state has committed to match it. So, comments or questions there? Great. Chris, please continue.
Oh, thank you. The next section is entitled Attachment 5 and Attachment 6. The first is a list of all the projects that may be constructed from non-state appropriated funds, whether these are bond funds or federal grants or donations or other university sources. And it's presented in this here primarily for the benefit of the university staff. This requires legislative approval. This signals a year in advance what the possible PO&M requirements might be in the future, and that's part of the process that eventually if any of these functions become an educational and general space. Sometimes it's not the entire building, but maybe a room or two in a building that is then provided for in the operating budget. So again, this is pretty much a technical item, but it is very important to our universities that they receive those funds, the state money, to operate buildings they build from non-state sources. And then if I may move to the next page 2, and I won't go over in this detail, but again, these are the requests in light of the reductions that we've seen in PICO over the past. Some of our universities have looked at the out years and seen that they have money that's been appropriated that they don't see the chance of being able to use on the projects for which it was appropriated. So for the most part, these reappropriations consolidate projects so that they can move forward with certain projects rather than having funds that sit waiting for PICO dollars. I'd be glad to go through any of those in detail. And then the very last item is a very technical item. It's not an attachment. If we go back to the very first page, it's page 2, Ancillary Construction Trust Fund. This has been historically, it's the last item, $141 million. Historically, we've used this to hold the bond proceeds for parking garages, dormitories that are issued through Division of Bond Finance. Division of Bond Finance, State Treasury, our office has come up with a different way of doing that, where it goes into Treasury called Special Purpose Investment Accounts. So it will not require state budget authority. It's not state dollars. I would argue it probably should not have been appropriated in the past because they're bond construction projects, but we no longer need to ask for that $141 million of authority only. So that completes the amendments to the legislative budget request.
Thanks, Chris. Any questions on the additional components we just spoke about, any of the transfers of funds? It makes sense to me to consolidate into projects that are accomplishable. But any questions there? All right, seeing none, is there a motion to adopt the facilities and real estate and budget proposal? Motion by Governor Temple. Is there a second? Second by, was that Governor Stavros? Oh, or Tripp, Governor Tripp. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye. And opposed? The one aye carries. Thank you for voting, Governor Tripp. Next on the agenda, if you'll turn to your page 38, you will see our Facilities Committee work plan, the same conversation we had with the Budget and Finance Committee work plan. We will set out the work plan and try to stay true to it through the course of the year. I fully expect modifications to the Facilities Committee work plan this year. Those things change fairly regularly, but we have a starting point and a guideline. So if you'll take a look at that and be comfortable with them. We will be talking a little bit in strategic planning today about some projects with the University of Florida and Florida Gulf Coast University at our strategic planning committee, and we'll leave that for Governor Martin. As you've had a chance to look at this and be briefed, are there any items anyone else would like to add to the work plan for the Facilities and Real Estate Committee? Okay, seeing none, we'll move forward with that. And if you'll take a look at page 39, you will see again our fixed capital outlay budget cycle, the same way you saw our budget and our LBR cycle during the budget committee. That sets forth the planning and the cycle which we follow in order to determine our PICO requests and this committee's body of requests. So if you just take a look at that, that will be important as we work through the year as well. Any questions on the cycles? All right, seeing none, now we're going to move into our long-awaited, no, this is actually very cool, capital presentation. We were going to try to take this issue up at our January meeting. We were unable to do so because of time constraints. But at this time, Chris is going to walk us through what was accomplished in the last year on our capital projects. Keep in mind, every project Chris is going to discuss was approved by this board. And it's an exciting presentation, and we get it almost, I mean, this is incredible. What a great screen to watch it on. I'm going to turn my chair around if you all don't mind. Chris, please begin.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think this is going to be one of the more exciting things we've had happen for the Facilities Committee, and we've done this in the past, but I think we have more projects than we've ever had before. We're coming off that wave of historic PICO funding, that we have projects funded from a large variety of sources. We're going to start with all projects over $2 million. We have over 30 projects, over $700 million worth of construction completed in 1 year, but not just from PICO. I just want to use this just as an example to show you, for the most part, these slides are self-explanatory, but it's got the name of the project, the square footage, the construction amount, completion date, who was the contractor. I think over on the right, a key thing to focus on, all sources of funds, and you'll see that they're from a large variety of sources, and if there's any green features. I'll highlight just a few projects. I'm not going to dwell on each one. I don't have a lot of detail in front of me on these projects. If we have university representatives present, if you have a question, we'll see if we can answer it here. If not, we will get back to you as quickly as possible. Obviously, this just a small expansion to their hazardous waste facility. Here's a project.
Don't wait till the end of the presentation. Just fire them out there for Chris to deal with, or the appropriate university representative. Otherwise, the project will be flipping back through slides.
Yeah, there's no going back. Okay, this is a CITF funded project, a child care center, something you might not think of, as a typical university type construction. Very nice looking facility. Let me jump back. I went too fast. Facility at Florida Atlantic University, and here we see this is a Cortellis project. But, we won't be seeing a lot of Cortellis projects in the next, few years. You'll see quite a few on these slides. Gulf Coast, this is their central energy plant. They're really a leader in energy innovation. This is 54 thermal storage tanks they use for their chilled water loop. They cool it at night when electricity costs are lower and use it to run chilled water for their cooling on the campus during the day. It saves funding, and it's very innovative. Another fun, this is the Kapnick Botanical Garden. I thought this was interesting. This is the world's first significant tropical botanical garden that's been open in decades, and it's at Florida Gulf Coast University in Naples. Again, a Cortellis type project. Our lab schools, Florida State University, this is a lab addition to their lab school. It's a charter school. We will cover later, FAMU just completed its new lab school. P.K. Young at the University of Florida is looking to do some significant renovation in its property, but we have to also look out for the interest of our university lab schools. Administration building at the University of North Florida. It was obviously not the entire facility at 137,000 square feet, but this was a significant addition, renovation to University of North Florida. We build a lot of projects from bond proceeds. We bring before this board the bond resolutions and the debt guidelines, and a lot of times it seems very perfunctory and dull, but these parking garages and dormitories are essential to university life, and this is, again, at Gulf Coast, which you can really see. That's our newest and growing the fastest of our universities, and a lot of these slides reflect that. University of Florida, we think of it being in Gainesville, but of course with IFAS, but not just IFAS, it is all over the state. This is the Pediatric Dental Center. It's a collaboration between the Naples Children and Education Foundation, University of Florida College of Dentistry, and Edison State College. And it provides specialized comprehensive dental care to children in Southwest Florida. So this is a very important outreach of the University of Florida. Here's another project built from Capital Improvement Trust Fund. That's the student fee funded projects. And again, it's 2009. We're looking at using, they use funds all the way going back to 05, 06. So CITF is still a good source, but it takes a lot of CITF money to build a project like this. Again, Florida Gulf Coast, a very, more traditional looking academic building. We have band buildings. I was surprised by this. I thought, well, University of Florida probably already had a band building, but here they have a nice brand new band building. Again, a more traditional classroom facility for the University of Florida. That's a traditional, what you would think of as a standard PICO type facility. Florida State, this is a very large CITF project, very nice looking building, very traditional, $13 million. Very important. I think the green features here of note, the low flow fixtures, the water and energy efficiency. I think you can see in the facility we're in, Florida State is definitely incorporating a lot of green technology in its new buildings, as all the universities are. This one I really did want to look at. This was appropriate only 2 years ago. This is one of the largest solar fields in the southeast. At Florida Gulf, it's 16 acres. It generates 2 megawatts. They went through a lot to develop this, including a $1 million reduction in last January as part of the special session. They lost $1 million on the project, but were able to work with the vendor, who's also a partner on this, to keep up the same number of solar panels, and they completed it just this last January. So a project that went up very quickly for something that's really state-of-the-art and one of a kind, especially in the state of Florida. And this will be a great value to the university. It will offset some of their operating costs for electricity. Florida A&M, this is their Commons building. This is basically a combination study space, cafeteria, academic advising. This is like that one-stop shop that we hear so often. FAMU has done it. I've seen the facility. It really is remarkable. This is an old historic property, but it's been completely renovated. We have athletic facilities. This was not funded from PICO. It's funded by the UAA at University of Florida, but $16 million for lacrosse. It's again, very remarkable. Another source, we haven't even touched on this yet, buildings are built from the research foundations, from either grant money or administrative overhead costs on the grants, and $17 million building built entirely without state funding. The building we're sitting in today, this was built with university funds, not PICO funds, and yet I've looked around the facility. It does have some classroom space. We have spaces for meetings like this. I think you all get to appreciate this building very much today. Residence Hall, Florida Gulf, again, we will have in our May board meeting, we'll be approving, I think, the 10th Residence Hall at Florida Gulf Coast. I think when you actually see some of these bond projects and see the size of them, it's really surprising. It surprises me, and I'm involved in it day to day. Gulf Coast Academic Building 7. There's a green feature. 90% of this building is going to be powered by the the solar field. Stop me at any time with a question. We're building for University of Central Florida. I really like this building, the design of this building. It's a very beautiful looking building. Again, here is the FAMU DRS school. It just opened this year. It's on the south side of the FAMU campus, and I think it's really done wonders for that DRS school having a new facility like that. The Heavener Football Complex. Now, this was a bond-funded project. It was approved by the board. This was the first platinum LEED building in the state of Florida, not just in the state university system, but in the entire state, public or private, and it's at the University of Florida. So something they can be very much proud of, but we can be proud of as a board. I mean, we approved this project. And they say the quote is that this building uses 25% less electricity than a building of like size that's built to normal conventional standards. A building at the University of West Florida, I don't know if you can see from the right side, but this facility is basically, it's a big square and a big round building. So if you ever get a chance to see it or even see it online, it's a very neat type of design. They're doing a lot of work with virtual reality, and I think they have this room. Perhaps Dr. Bentz could tell us more about it at some point in time. It's almost like a virtual reality holodeck type space for design type work. North Florida, the Student Union, what I really like about this facility is if you look on the right-hand side, you can see that sort of portico porch, and if you look really close, you can see there's some students underneath, and they use that to have meetings outdoors and I guess rallies and things of that nature, and it really makes great use of space that it might otherwise just be wasted space. And you can see from a variety of sources, PICO, Carry Forward, Auxiliary, CITF, they pulled out all the stops to make this building happen. The teaching gym at Florida A&M, this is, of course, has the basketball arena. This is a wonderful facility. I've toured it. It has all of their athletic programs are housed here, their dance program. It's used year-round. It's not just a basketball arena. It's used, they have screens that go across the basketball court, and they can use that for various teaching exercises. and it really is a great building for the university. Starting to move up in cost, $46.4 million at FIU. This is their health center, and it meets the needs of the nursing, health, science, research labs, and I'm sure this will be a great asset to their new medical program as well, to have a facility like this on the campus. Continue move up, University of Florida pathogens. This is the first research facility in our state focused on new infectious diseases that threaten plants, animals, people, and food safety. So this is an 80,000 square foot facility. It has all kinds of level 2, level 3 biolabs. This is doing world-class research that may, one day save all our lives. And we, if we have another pandemic that's not quite as tame as H1N1. Next up, and we're coming near to the end of the program, the $68 million dorm at the University of South Florida. Again, I know we have a lot of meetings at the University of South Florida, and I would definitely say this facility is well worth a tour or a drive-by. This is something, if you have not been to college in a while, dorms are not like they used to be. It's like people actually want to live on campus. Maybe that's, maybe the dorms are too nice. They don't want to graduate. Now, actually, the research actually shows that if you can keep a student on campus in a good learning environment, they have classrooms in here, the cafeteria is here, all the learning and support system is right there, you'll improve your graduation, you'll improve your retention, and it's all funded with bond money. It's not funded with state dollars whatsoever. And finally, UCF, the Burnett Biomedical. I think this is the largest facility in terms of dollar terms the state university system has ever constructed, $112 million, and it is complete, but it should be opening, Dr. Hitt, I believe May, June, is that correct? Well, it's 2 different buildings, yeah. 2 different buildings. Part of it's open already. So it's a huge building and very important. And with that, that concludes the presentation. Thank you for allowing me to have this time with you.
Thank you, Chris. Any questions for Chris on the presentation? Any presidents want to brag? Anything?
Mr. Chair, can I make a comment? And somewhere my analogy will break down. We do a lot of things really very well as a system. I'm not sure we do anything better as a system than our facilities process. We all know it lovingly as the PICO process. Well, what is the PICO process? It's the concept that stands behind New Florida. It's the idea that if we can better forecast our funding going forward, even though PICO, as we know, is subject to peaks and valleys, rising and falling, we can put in place a system with that predictable capability, even in a projected mode, where we're able to do a similar kind of approach with our universities that we use with PICO. And what stood behind us today on that big screen was a perfect example of bottom line accountability, exact expenditures and accounting, the idea that these were not thought up on the spot. These were literally years in the creation, so what was ultimately created was not only first class, but PO&M money built in to make sure that the buildings are maintained for as long as they stand, that they are mission specific, that they're not just thrown up as buildings in which to put people, but they have to be tied to the specific missions of the universities and of the system. Again, I'm sure that analogy breaks down somewhere, but when members of the legislature say, why New Florida? What stands behind us, I think, is a perfect illustration of what we could accomplish as a system if we were able to look toward a better projected and more predictable funding stream to give us the ability to plan for years ahead as opposed to year. Couple that with our growing accountability system, our mission differential plans. It is a perfect illustration, I think, of what we could do with our entire system of universities beyond just that which we do for capital construction. So thanks for giving everybody the chance to see that today, because it's more than just a lot of very beautiful buildings. I think it's a direct example of how well we can plan as a system if we have that capability.
Mr. Chairman, I think that one thing that I would like to commend the universities on, and something I hope that we all were looking and watching and looking at, is that the ways you put together the different funding sources to make this happen. I think that the creativity that the universities have used to kind of put together big projects is certainly commendable, and I would hope that everyone kind of watch that so we can all kind of learn from that process. I think that, you know, so often, particularly in lean years like we're experiencing now, when we just rely upon PICO, we will find ourselves shortchanged and waiting for a while. So if we can kind of each take a look at that particular part of the presentation and see how universities are putting together packages that make sense, I think that it will certainly be beneficial for the entire system. So just want to make that comment.
Any other comments or questions for Tim with regard to the PICO at all? Certainly, Governor Temple. Nope. Okay. On any other matter, Governor, that we've dealt with? We're about to adjourn this joint committee, so if there's any matter on budget, finance, or PICO, final questions or concerns?
Yeah, can we go back to Bright Futures for a second?
Absolutely. So it's the yellow sheet, which are the recommended changes to Bright Futures from the legislature.
Yeah, from the legislature. I mean, what is our position on this? One, I mean, I can just tell you, I think the medallion criteria is too low, and there still is not a needs test in this. I mean, so can someone talk about the dialogue we have with the legislature? And now we're laying this out, and it's going to be hard to chop away at it. It looks like it to me.
Yeah, I'll ask the chancellor to comment on that, Governor, but I will say that we're not laying this out. The legislature
I understand that.
has laid this out.
But what's our role, kind of what's our position?
That is a conversation I've been anxious to have for 2 years, Governor. Let's ask the chancellor his thoughts.
This is it's a good question, and we are actually dissecting all of this information right now. This we came into possession of, Tim, several days ago. Yeah, it was just written, and we're actually looking at this now. What we're interested in seeing, what would be the net effect of this? How many students would no longer projected qualify for Bright Futures? How much money differential would there be between what we're investing in Bright Futures now, what would be invested, projected going forward if these things were to change? So I wish I had a very specific answer for you, other than, believe me, we are working on this right now to see what kind of net effect these things would have. I don't think anyone disagrees. I'm fairly sure with that. I've always said that Bright Futures should evolve over time. I think most people agree with that. And when Bright Futures was actually created, and I was there, the intent was, from that point forward, that Bright Futures should change, should morph, should evolve over time. The numbers with SAT are a perfect example. No one, when Bright Futures was created, ever believed that those numbers would remain the same for as long as they have. For political reasons, they have. They've essentially always remained the same. And now, while we're looking at what kinds of changes would go forward with Bright Futures, and Governor Barnes and student leaders have been working on this one too, and noodling on this one, how to change Bright Futures so it made more sense going forward for the future. So this is the legislative cut of what they believe changes would look like. And Tim, I can't even remember, is this the House or the Senate version? Okay, so we'll dissect this information and come back to the board with more direct information on what this might mean to the system going forward. Again, everyone, I think, generally agrees there needs to be long-awaited changes made to Bright Futures. We're just not sure yet what these changes were predicated on and what they might mean by way of net effect.
Yeah, I think, not wanting to speak for Governor Temple, his issue is not exactly what these changes mean, but whether or not we would like to weigh in with some suggested changes of our own at some point in time. And I, for one, would love to have that conversation at some point in time, sooner than later.
And I think we should, Chairman. I think, it is time for the Board of Governors and the universities to weigh in on this issue. It's interesting with this one. This is one that everybody believes needs to change, and yet nobody wants to get within 500 yards of it because of the blowback that you get. And yet, if it is going to change, and it already has, remember last year with differential tuition, there were some fairly significant changes that came as a result of differential tuition to Bright Futures, obviously more being forecasted. I think it's critical that we as a system individual institutions and the system weigh in on what we believe bright futures should look like going forward, or it will surely change based on what others believe it ought to look like.
Well, I believe we provide a lot of cover for that, and we had to weigh in on this.
Governor, perhaps we should ask the chair to consider appointing a task force to look at this issue.
Well, and certainly we can do that. My concern is that if things are going to happen this session, how quickly can a task force actually pull itself together and really implement or make some changes? I know we've had some discussions about this issue previously, and I'm not sure if we actually adopted any positions, as a board. I'm sorry, Mr. Chair.
No, I was going to say, I don't believe we've adopted any positions as a board, other than we've all agreed that it's a conversation that needs to happen at some point. And I would be less concerned about a focus on this session, because I think what's going to happen this session is likely to happen this session. But moving forward, as the Chancellor points out, as Bright Futures continues to evolve, I think we should have a position stake at the table there.
And I think, Mr. Chairman, I'm not trying to take Governor Bourne's thunder. He may want to weigh in on this, but we don't have to start with a blank sheet of paper on proposed changes. I know that students have done a significant body of work on this. I know each university has their own take on how they believe the program should morph in the future. So I think, to your point, there is an opportunity, and I think, as you both pointed out, a responsibility for the system to step up to the plate and provide some recommendations for how Bright Futures might look at going forward.
And Chair, if I may just touch on that, this is an issue that the students of Florida, specifically with the Florida Student Association, have been looking at for not just this year, but as well as Chair Perez for a long time. And this is one of our main issues on the FSA's legislative agenda this year. Student leaders have been meeting with their legislators, with their representatives, talking about this issue. And I think that, like Chairman Perez is saying, this is something that we really need to, again, at this point, the task force might not. What's going to happen this session is going to happen, but at the same time, I think this is something that the students and, the BOG specifically need to come together on, because, like Governor Temple said, I mean, we've got a long way to go, and the students appreciate what the program has been, and the whole reason for Bright Futures was keeping the best and the brightest in the state, and I think we've been accomplishing that, but at the same time, we understand that there's not a money tree that's just being shaken to continue this program. So I think that moving forward, it's so important that we have the students involved with that discussion.
As always. Before we close, let me kick it over to Chair Parker to see if she's got any final remarks.
Thank you so much, Governor Perez, or Chairman Perez. One is that I will follow the lead of Mr. Chairman as well as Governor Temple, and we'll appoint a task force to have us develop a position and certainly have it taken up at one of our future board meetings and really devote some extensive time to the issue, because certainly I think it is something that falls under our responsibility to provide some leadership and direction on. Second, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for extending a warm welcome to our new members to your committee, and also want to mention to you all that although you have not been appointed to serve on any of the committees, you're certainly always welcome to make any comments or ask any questions or express any concerns. And I know that a second ago, the Chairman extended the opportunity to the board in general, but I also want to take a second to invite our new members. If you have any comments or questions that you want to ask, and maybe we're holding back on because you weren't sure if you had the opportunity or the right to speak since you weren't an official part of the meeting, certainly please take a minute now, if you have any questions or concerns, to voice them on any of the issues that were discussed today. Okay. Other than that, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for running a very interesting meeting this morning. I know that we've had a lot of enthusiasm here, but it's 8:30 seems to be early, and certainly the presentation on the facilities that we have worked on in the last year was actually fascinating. So thank you very much for your leadership.
Well, indeed. Thanks, Chris and Tim, for all your support, as always. You guys are an incredible team. If there anything else, if not, we stand adjourned.
Great. I think that our next meeting is our Student Affairs and Campus Life Committee. I think that Mr. Marshall is going to be convening that. We want to take a 5-minute break before we get started. Yeah, let's take a 5-minute break and we'll get started in 5 minutes. Thank you.
John, you're so good.